again, I think there were sort of different factions and schools of thought, but there was one, nationalist element, I think, that believed very much in this idea of Novorossiya and the idea that the regions of southern and eastern Ukraine, essentially the half of the country east of the Dnieper River, including, the Black Sea coast and Odessa, were, by their nature, fundamentally pro-Russian, and it would be easy enough to engineer some sort of secession movement that would, because this new government had come to power in Kyiv, which again was by all standards of Ukrainian politics just sort of a normal Ukrainian government with familiar faces. But still, there were some in the Kremlin who thought, like, here's our moment to cleave the country in half. And so what we saw was that a lot of money and, expertise, so to speak, was flowing into some local provocateur groups throughout eastern and southern Ukraine to try and have these small Maidans in the regional capitals, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, etc. And in the hopes that, again, they would just sort of declare that they no longer had allegiance to the government in Kyiv, and then it would create this pathway for what Russian leadership, and it was particularly Foreign Minister Lavrov who would talk about this, the federalization of Ukraine. That was a big talking point of theirs in the March-April timeframe. What they meant by federalization, it sounds fine in theory. I mean, we're a federal country. Germany is a federation. What's the issue with federate? Russia technically is, although it doesn't act like one. But what the Russians really meant was something kind of like how Bosnia works or doesn't work, frankly, where you have these statelets which have such a degree of autonomy that they can effectively paralyze the central government. And so, that was not the history of how modern independent Ukraine was set up, but that's what the Russians wanted to push for. And they wanted enough of a sort of critical mass of the so-called regions in Novorossiya that would threaten to secede unless there were this new constitution promulgated that would give them the ability to control Ukraine's strategic decision-making. Ultimately, we talk about this whole confrontation and conflict between Russia and Ukraine about, basically Putin's fundamental idea, again, which is not only Putin's, but he has taken it to the extreme, that the Russians believe that Ukraine should be part of the Russian orbit and that they want to block Ukraine's path to the West, to Europe, certainly to NATO, but that wasn't, in my view, the main issue at that time. It was about the EU, and it was about this civilizational push and pull and the idea that Ukrainians wanted to be in Europe and Russia wanted to find any possible way to block that, and had failed in the efforts to persuade through soft power Ukraine to stay in the so-called orbit. I mean, already that was sort of abandoned in the 90s. All they had left was hard power to try and destroy the thing from the inside so that Ukraine wouldn't move westward. So I think that was the main objective in the beginning. But the issue was that Russia, as it did later in 2022, vastly overestimated and fundamentally misunderstood the political views of local business and political elites throughout the country. And so you saw a very clear case in which local power brokers in the east and south of Ukraine pushed back against this secessionist narrative. And so Russia was having, and its sort of proxies at that point, again, it was very loose. They were trying to align themselves with kind of local criminals and so on. They tried to get the mafia involved, and the mafia wasn't interested. So the Ukrainian mafia.
If you don't have the mafia on your side.
Yeah, the Odessa mafia's role in actually saving Odessa as part of the Ukrainian state is something interesting for another conversation. But they basically thought that these regions would fall into Russia's lap, and they didn't. And so they had to keep escalating. And that's where you saw additional figures brought in from Moscow, people like Strelkov or Girkin, the former GRU officer, Vladimir Antufeev, I recall, who had been active in the Transnistria conflict, and they brought him in to try to bang heads together and make this thing work a bit better. But ultimately, they failed everywhere except in the Donbass.